Hi, and welcome back to this Thursday edition of Focal Point AFR Talk. Just a program correction. My guest from Ukraine, Rick Dayton, will be my guest in about 15 minutes at the bottom of the hour. Was on a mission trip to Ukraine when everything began to fall apart, and he had to scramble to get out of the country before the doors closed on him. So he will be my guest at the bottom of the hour. Now, I've got a column up at rightlyconcerned.com. It's up at our news site, onenewsnow.com. And I just want to hit the highlights of this column. It summarizes a lot of what we have talked about on this program, but I really wanted to write one column that kind of crystallized my thinking about the importance of the debate over gay rights, over special rights for homosexuals, special rights that are based on sexually deviant behavior. Now, I want to make it clear we are talking here about special rights. We're not talking about equal rights. We're talking about special rights. We believe in equal rights for everyone. We want everybody's constitutional rights to be respected. We want their right to the free exercise of religion to be respected. We want their right to freedom of speech, their right to freedom of the press, their right to freedom of association. In other words, this gay hairdresser that doesn't want to cut the hair of the New Mexico governor, we're fine with that. That's freedom of association. And we support that. It's the homosexual lobby that doesn't. They want to compel us to provide services to people against our will. That is slavery, as Tammy Bruce, the lesbian author, pointed out. And my point in this column is that this really is the battle of our time. There is no other battle. The battle over special rights on the basis of homosexual behavior is the battle of our time, and there is no other battle. Why do I say this? Because America's future, I believe, America's future is going to be determined by one thing and one thing only, and that is whether the forces of light or darkness will prevail in the battle over special rights based on sexually deviant behavior. Now, deviant sounds like a harsh term, but it's just an accurate term because it refers to behavior that deviates from the norm. It deviates from God's design. God has clearly designed sexual expression for men and women. He's designed marriage to be the union of one man and one woman. He's designed sex to be exclusively expressed in the marriage relationship between one man and one woman. That means that every kind of sexual expression outside the marriage relationship, whether it is what we call fornication, sexual immorality between two single people, or adultery, sex between a married individual and somebody he's not married to, is contrary to God's design. It's interesting, by the way, that in the military, there is a general, the highest ranking military officer who's ever been subject to a court-martial. He's basically going to get drummed out of the military because he's admitted that he was involved in an adulterous affair. Adultery is a crime in the military. Under the Universal Code of Military Justice, adultery is a crime. So let's not hear any of this stuff about how we don't discriminate on the basis of sexually immoral behavior. We do all the time. Even when it's behavior between consenting adults, we discriminate against prostitution, even though it's sexual behavior among consenting adults. We discriminate against incest, even though it may be consenting behavior or a behavior among consenting adults. So let's not hear, and adultery is still a crime in the United States military. It's a crime. You go to the brig for that. You can get cashiered for that. So let's not hear any of this nonsense about how it's always in every circumstance inappropriate to discriminate on the basis of sexually immoral behavior. And my contention is, look, homosexual behavior is sexually immoral. It is as sexually immoral as adultery is, and it ought to be subject to the same kind of sanctions. It ought to be contrary to public policy, as adultery is in the military, as prostitution is in all of society. But the point here is we've got a major cultural battle between the forces of religious liberty and the forces of the homosexual agenda. And whoever wins this tug of war, whoever wins this culture clash is going to decide whether America has a future or not. And my point here quite simply is that we have to choose as a nation between homosexuality and religious liberty, between sodomy and liberty, because we can't have both. We have to choose between one or the other. There is no middle ground. And I read that column from Matt Lewis, Daily Caller, saying, look, we are involved now in a zero-sum game. Somebody's going to win, and somebody is going to lose. And my point, I've made it before, but every advance of the homosexual agenda comes at the expense of religious liberty. Now, Americans want to believe otherwise. Americans want to believe that we can have sodomy and liberty, that they can coexist, but it is impossible. Everywhere that big gay gains ground, Christ is forced into retreat. Let me repeat that. Everywhere that big gay, the homosexual lobby, the homosexual agenda, the homosexual regime, every time they gain ground, Christ, Christianity, religious liberty is forced into retreat. So my point is everything hinges on the outcome of this cultural conflict, whether America is going to continue to be a beacon of faith, family, freedom, liberty, truth, morality is going to be determined by who wins this battle. Now, my contention is if the forces of sexual normalcy and natural marriage prevail in this cultural class, then America once again will move the entire world. We will once again be the leader of the entire world, moving the entire globe toward the sunlit uplands. That's a phrase from Winston Churchill, the sunlit uplands of civilization, of family, of morality, of stability, of decency, of goodness and prosperity. But if the forces of sexual deviancy prevail, I submit that every part of our culture will be corrupted. It will be contaminated beyond repair. And America, instead of leading the world, will plunge the world into a moral abyss of darkness and depravity. And you look at what's happened to wedding vendors, and it's an example of exactly what I'm talking about. Christian bakers now are facing fines and jail time for politely declining to throw flour and eggs into an oven on behalf of the gay Gestapo. You know, and I mentioned Tammy Bruce, the column that she wrote. She said, look, these Christian bakers, if they are forced to bake cakes for people against their will, that is slavery. That's what you do to slaves. Slaves have no choice. They are forced to provide labor and services for somebody against their will. That is a form of slavery. And she also says if they're being forced to do it against their conscience, that's not only slavery, that is abject tyranny. And that's exactly what we have going on. And my point is religious principle, tolerance, rights of conscience, all of these things mean absolutely nothing to pro-sodomy advocates in our culture. They will remorselessly crush anyone or anything that gets in their path without mercy and without a second thought. They will extinguish the light of sexual normalcy, the light of sexual morality, as well as the light of Christianity. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that big gay, the homosexual lobby, they have the will to crush biblical Christianity into little bitty pieces. What they lack only is the power to do so. Now you think about America, and religious liberty is the quintessential American characteristic. I suggest it is the thing that sets us apart from the nations of the world. This is the value that distinguishes us from every nation in the world. This country was founded by Christians who were looking for the freedom to worship God and to serve him in daily life according to the dictates of conscience. Now, the very first unalienable God-given right that the founders protected in the Constitution is the free exercise of the Christian religion. And I am quoting the phrase free exercise for a point because free exercise means exactly that. It is the freedom to live out your faith, to exercise your faith, not just between 11 and noon on Sunday, but 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including the freedom to run your business according to Christian principle. And what I submit to you is without religious liberty, America is not America. It's something else. It's something alien. It's something foreign. It is something that Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Adams would simply not recognize. You know, I've mentioned before that Washington literally drummed homosexuals out of the Continental Army, drummed them out of the Army. Thomas Jefferson wrote a law in 1778, 2 years after he wrote the Declaration of Independence, a law for Virginia that was adopted that provided castration as the penalty for sodomy. Now, I'm not advocating that we go back to that. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying, look, to think that these men would find even the thought of same-sex marriage a possibility, it'd be literally inconceivable to men like this that you'd have such a thing as same-sex marriage. And I think what advocates of sodomy-based marriage want to do is they want to put Christians so far into retreat that we don't even poke our heads outside the doors and the windows of our own church buildings. This is exactly what Hitler did to the church in his day, because he knew that the only thing he had to fear, the only institution that could stop him in his quest for totalitarian control, was the church. And so Hitler cooked up these slogans. The church must be separate from the state. Politics do not belong in the church. Those are slogans that came from Adolf Hitler. They didn't come from the ACLU. They came from Adolf Hitler. Politics do not belong in the church. That's Adolf Hitler. That's the propaganda machine for Nazi Germany. The church must be separate from the state. That's a quote. That's a slogan, a motto from the mind of Adolf Hitler. And I remember talking to a lesbian activist one time. This is back when I was still in Boise. And it was when I was just first beginning to publicly oppose the homosexual agenda. She got right up in my face one time and she said, look, speaking to me as a pastor, I don't care what you teach in your church. I don't care what you preach in your church. I don't care what you do in your church. I don't care what you believe in your church, as long as you keep it there. She said, the church may belong to you, but the public square belongs to us. And again, I want to stress that we believe in constitutional rights for everybody. The right to religion, speech, the press, assembly, self-defense, trial by jury, all of that. We believe in that. We want equal rights for everyone, but there is no constitutional right to engage in sodomy. You can read the Constitution front to back, upside down, right to left. You can read it in Sanskrit. You will not find the word sodomy or a right to engage in sexual perversion anywhere in the Constitution whatsoever. Now, here's what Winston Churchill said. And this, I think, is a lesson for the church and for people of faith today. Here's what Churchill said back in the dark days of World War II. If you will not fight for right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when your victory is sure and not too costly, you may come to the moment when you will have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. There may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope of victory, because it is better to perish than to live as slaves. So I'm submitting that the time to stand against the war machine of the homosexual regime is now, today. It's still a battle the forces of goodness can win, but we must not wait another day. Back in 2.